Hello and welcome to the Whispering Worlds channel. What would you do if the foundation of your marriage was shaken by betrayal? Follow Michael and Clara's gripping journey as they navigate heartbreak, tough decisions, and the painful truth of rebuilding or letting go. This is not just their story. It's a tale of resilience, forgiveness, and the raw complexities of relationships. Now, we invite you to become part of their world. Share your thoughts. What choices would you make in Michael's shoes? Can Clara's mistakes be redeemed? Your perspective could shape the way we explore stories like this in the future. Dive into the emotional highs and lows of this bittersweet journey. Read the story, and let your voice be heard. The first sign was subtle, so faint that I nearly dismissed it as an oddity. Clara, my wife of 8 years, had been quieter than usual during dinner. She pushed her food around on the plate, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Our evenings, typically punctuated by laughter or spirited debates about the latest episode of her favorite crime drama, had grown eerily silent over the last month. Something had shifted, but what? "You okay?" I finally asked, setting down my fork. My voice sounded awkward even to me, as though the question was heavier than I intended. She glanced up, startled, as if I'd interrupted a dream. "Yeah, just tired," she said with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I nodded, not wanting to press further. But later, as I cleared the dishes while she retreated to the couch with her phone, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. We lived in suburban Milwaukee, a place where the streets were lined with maple trees and the seasons dictated every aspect of life. Our neighborhood was tight-knit, filled with families who hosted block parties and exchanged casserole recipes. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed happy, at least on the surface. Clara and I had met in college, and what started as a whirlwind romance had settled into the steady rhythm of married life. We weren't without our challenges, but I thought we had built something unshakable, or so I'd believed. That night, as I lay in bed, I reached for her hand. She'd fallen asleep facing the wall, her breathing steady and shallow. I hesitated, then let my hand drop away. "It's nothing," I told myself, even though the knot in my chest said otherwise. Rising tension. Over the next few weeks, Clara's absences became more frequent. She started staying late at work, citing endless projects and tight deadlines. I'd see her typing furiously on her laptop late into the night or whispering on the phone in the kitchen. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd wave me off with a casual, "Just a colleague." Her friend group expanded, too. She began going out with people I barely knew, a group of women from her book club and a few colleagues from her office. I didn't think much of it at first. Clara was sociable and had always enjoyed a bustling social life. But when she began mentioning a name repeatedly, Ryan, one of her work friends, I couldn't ignore the unease bubbling beneath the surface. "Ryan's hilarious," she said one evening, laughing as she recounted a story he'd told during lunch. "He's got this way of turning even the most mundane things into something funny." I tried to join in her amusement, but something about the way her face lit up when she spoke about him made my stomach twist. Was I imagining things? Was my jealousy unwarranted? I confided in my best friend, Dave, over beers one Friday night. Dave had been my rock since high school, the kind of friend who could make you laugh even when the world felt like it was falling apart. "You're probably overthinking it," Dave said, though his brows knitted together in concern. "But if it bothers you, just talk to her." Easier said than done. Every time I tried to bring it up, the words felt clumsy, and I ended up dropping the subject altogether. Clara was good at deflecting, and I was terrible at confrontation. A new discovery. One Saturday morning, while Clara was at a yoga class, I decided to tackle the mountain of laundry that had piled up over the week. As I sorted through the clothes, her phone buzzed on the counter. My eyes flicked to the screen. It was a message from Ryan. "Can't wait to see you tonight." Smiley face. My breath hitched. My hands froze mid-fold, and my heart thudded against my ribs. What did he mean by tonight? And why hadn't Clara mentioned any plans? The sound of the garage door opening jolted me back to reality. Clara's yoga class must have ended early. I shoved the phone back onto the counter and resumed folding clothes, my hands trembling. When she walked in, Flushed and glowing from her workout, I managed a strained smile. "How was class?" I asked, my voice a pitch too high. "Good," she said, dropping her gym bag by the door. "I'm meeting up with some friends later, by the way. Don't wait up for me." I nodded, forcing a casual tone. "Sounds fun." But as the day wore on, the knot in my chest tightened. The message replayed in my mind like a broken record. I couldn't shake the suspicion that Clara wasn't being entirely honest with me. That night, as I lay in bed alone, I resolved to uncover the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. By Sunday morning, my mind was a swirling mess of unease and suspicion. Clara's words from the previous day replayed in my head. She hadn't even tried to conceal her plans. Yet that message from Ryan had planted a seed of doubt that grew like a weed overnight. I needed clarity, something concrete to either confirm or disprove my worst fears. But how? "What's going on with you?" Dave asked that afternoon when he came over to watch the Packers game. He tossed a beer my way and settled into the recliner. "It's Clara," I said, gripping the cold can. "Something doesn't feel right. She's been distant." Dave raised an eyebrow. "Still about Ryan?" I nodded, and after a moment's hesitation, I told him about the text message. He whistled low. "That doesn't sound great." "No," I muttered, the words like gravel in my throat. "But I don't want to jump to conclusions either." "Then find out," he said matter-of-factly. "You deserve to know the truth." That night, Clara returned home late. I'd been half asleep on the couch when I heard the front door click open. She moved quietly, trying not to wake me, but I watched through heavy eyelids as she slipped off her heels and headed upstairs. The faintest whiff of a cologne I didn't recognize lingered in the air. A new plan. Monday morning I called in sick to work. It wasn't like me to play hooky, but my thoughts were too scattered to focus on anything else. Instead, I spent the morning researching private investigators online. By noon, I'd scheduled a consultation with a man named Stan Wallace, a no-nonsense professional whose reviews touted his discretion and efficiency. When I walked into his dimly lit office later that afternoon, the smell of stale coffee and paper greeted me. Stan, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair and a wrinkled suit, gestured for me to take a seat. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his tone clipped but not unkind. I explained the situation, laying out my concerns with as much detail as I could muster. Stan listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes in a leather-bound notebook. "It's not uncommon," he said when I finished. "People don't come to me because they're happy. They come because they need answers." "I just want the truth," I said, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "Whatever it is." Stan nodded. "I'll need access to her schedule, phone records, and any other details you can provide. We'll start there." As I left his office, a strange mix of relief and dread settled over me. I'd taken the first step toward uncovering the truth, but I couldn't shake the fear of what that truth might reveal. Clara's world. Meanwhile, Clara seemed blissfully unaware of my growing suspicions. Over the next few days, she carried on as usual, making breakfast, chatting about work, and scrolling through her phone late into the night. But I noticed the cracks in her facade. She'd smile at me, but her eyes seemed elsewhere. Her laughter felt forced, like she was trying too hard to maintain the illusion of normalcy. One evening, as she got ready for yet another outing with her friends, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her apply lipstick in the mirror. "You've been going out a lot lately," I said, trying to keep my tone light. She glanced at me through the mirror's reflection. "I'm just trying to keep busy. Work's been stressful, you know that. Maybe we could go out together sometime," I suggested. "Just the two of us." Her hand faltered for the briefest moment before she resumed her task. "Sure," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. As she left that night, I couldn't help but feel the distance between us grow wider. The first clue. By Friday, Stan called with an update. "I've got something," he said, his voice low and measured. "Meet me at my office." My stomach churned as I made my way downtown. When I arrived, Stan handed me a manila folder. Inside were a series of photographs. Clara, laughing over drinks with Ryan at a trendy downtown bar. Clara, leaning in close to him, her hand grazing his arm. And then, Clara and Ryan walking arm in arm down a dimly lit street. I stared at the photos, my hands trembling. Felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I'd suspected something was off, but seeing the evidence in black and white made it all too real. "I'll keep digging if you want," Stan said, his voice cutting through my haze. "But you've got enough here to confront her if that's what you're planning." I nodded slowly, my mind spinning with questions and emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal. They all collided inside me like a storm. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice hollow. As I drove home that evening, the weight of the folder on the passenger seat felt unbearable. I wasn't sure how I was going to face Clara, but one thing was certain. Our lives would never be the same. The weekend came and went, but I couldn't bring myself to confront Clara. Every time I tried to find the right moment, the words stuck in my throat. The manila folder stayed hidden in the bottom drawer of my desk, its presence both a reminder and a weight I couldn't lift. By Monday evening, I'd had enough. The tension was eating me alive, and I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. When Clara came home from work, I was waiting for her in the living room. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag on the floor. "What's for dinner?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Her smile faltered. "What's wrong?" I gestured for her to sit, and after a moment's hesitation, she lowered herself onto the couch. I sat across from her, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. "Clara," I began, choosing my words carefully, "I've noticed things have been different between us lately." She shifted uncomfortably. "Different how?" "You've been distant," I said, "spending more time at work, going out with friends I don't know, and—" I hesitated, then decided to rip off the Band-Aid. "And I know about Ryan." Her eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of panic before she masked it with confusion. "Ryan? What about him?" "I know you've been seeing him," I said, my voice firmer now. "I saw the pictures." Clara's face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she managed a weak, "You hired someone to follow me?" "I didn't have a choice," I shot back. "You've been lying to me, Clara." I needed the truth. She looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me," I said, leaning closer, "because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been sneaking around behind my back." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then, Clara took a deep breath and met my gaze. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said quietly. "Ryan and I were just friends. But I guess I let it blur the lines." "Blur the lines," I repeated, my voice rising. "Clara, I saw you with him, holding hands, laughing like you didn't have a care in the world. That doesn't look like just friends to me." "It's complicated," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I've been so unhappy, Michael." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Unhappy?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Since when?" "I don't know," she said, wiping at her eyes. "It's not you, it's me. I've just felt so stuck. Like my life is this endless loop, and I can't break out of it." "So you decided to break it by cheating on me?" I said bitterly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "Well, you did," I said, standing abruptly. I paced the room, running my hands through my hair. "God, Clara, if you were unhappy, why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you say something?" "Because I didn't know how," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't want to hurt you." "And this was better?" I shouted, gesturing wildly. "Lying to me? Sneaking around? Making me feel like a fool?" Clara broke down, sobbing into her hands. I wanted to comfort her, but my anger wouldn't let me. Instead, I stood there, watching the woman I'd loved for years unravel before my eyes. Turning point. That night, Clara slept in the guest room. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and replaying our conversation in my mind. Her words haunted me. I've been so unhappy. Was I to blame? Had I been so caught up in my own world that I hadn't noticed her slipping away? Or was this simply who she was? Someone who couldn't be content, no matter how much she had? The next morning, I called Stan and told him to dig deeper. I needed to know everything, not just about Ryan, but about anyone else Clara might have been hiding from me. If there was more to this story, I had to uncover it. As the days passed, Clara and I barely spoke. The house felt like a battlefield, each room a silent reminder of what we'd lost. She tried to make amends, cooking dinner and asking how my day was, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. The betrayal was too fresh, the wounds too raw. Then, a week later, Stan called with another update. "You'll want to see this in person," he said, his tone grim. When I arrived at his office, he handed me another folder. This time, the contents were even more damning. Receipts for hotel stays, messages exchanged between Clara and Ryan that left little to the imagination, and photographs that made my stomach churn. "I'm sorry," Stan said quietly as I flipped through the evidence. I nodded numbly, my mind racing. This wasn't just a mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was a betrayal on a level I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. As I drove home, the weight of the folder pressed against me like a physical burden. Clara was in the kitchen when I walked in, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up and smiled weakly. "Hey," she said. "How was your day?" I set the folder on the counter and opened it. Her smile faded as she took in the contents. "What's this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The truth," I said, my voice cold. "No more lies, Clara. Not this time." Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages, her face growing paler with each passing second. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were filled with tears. "Michael," she whispered, "I can explain, but I didn't want explanations. I wanted answers." Clara sat across from me at the dining table, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The manila folder sat between us, its contents now scattered across the surface. The photographs, the receipts, the text messages, they painted a picture too vivid to deny. "Michael," she began, her voice trembling, "I know this looks bad, but what?" I snapped, cutting her off. "But it's not what it looks like. But you can explain? Because honestly, Clara, I don't think there's anything you can say that will make this better." Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't find it in me to feel sympathy. "Not now. Not after everything. I didn't mean for this to happen," she said softly. It started out as friendship and then what?" I demanded. "You decided your so-called friendship was worth throwing our marriage away." She flinched at my words but didn't argue. Instead, she dropped her gaze to the table, silent. That silence was deafening. Unspoken realizations. As the seconds ticked by, I felt my anger bubbling over, threatening to consume me. But beneath the fury, there was something else. A deep, aching sadness. This was the woman I'd built my life with, the woman I'd planned to grow old with. And now, here we were, sitting on opposite sides of the table, separated by more than just physical distance. "Why?" I asked finally, my voice quieter now. "Why wasn't I enough?" Her head snapped up, and for the first time, I saw genuine anguish in her eyes. "It wasn't about you," she said. "It's never been about you." "Then what?" I asked, my frustration mounting. "What was it about?" She hesitated, then took a shaky breath. "I felt lost," she admitted. "Like I'd become this version of myself I didn't recognize. I thought maybe Ryan could help me find who I was again." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So what? You used him? You used me?" "It wasn't like that," she insisted. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, you did," I said flatly. "And now here we are. Decisions to make." The room fell silent again, the weight of our conversation pressing down on both of us. I could feel the cracks in our marriage widening, threatening to shatter everything we'd built. Finally, Clara spoke. What happens now? I looked at her, the woman I'd loved for so long, and felt an overwhelming sense of loss. I don't know, I admitted, but I need time to think. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll stay with my sister for a while, she said. Give you some space. That might be best. I agreed, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. I didn't want her to leave, but I couldn't bear to look at her right now either. Quiet house. That evening, Clara packed a bag and left. The sound of her suitcase wheels rolling across the floor echoed through the house, and when the door closed behind her, the silence that followed was deafening. I sat in the living room for hours, staring at the empty walls and trying to make sense of everything. How had we ended up here? Where had it all gone wrong? My phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from Dave. Hey man, how are you holding up? I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. Not great. Clara's gone. I'll tell you everything later. His response was immediate. You're not alone, Mike. Call me if you need anything. The reassurance was small but comforting. At least I had someone in my corner, searching for answers. Over the next few days, I tried to distract myself with work, but my mind kept drifting back to Clara. I found myself replaying our conversations, dissecting her words, and trying to understand what had driven her to betray me. Was it really just a matter of feeling lost? Or was there something deeper at play? I spent hours going through the evidence Stan had collected, hoping to find some kind of clarity. But the more I looked, the more questions I had. How long had this been going on? Had there been others before Ryan? And most importantly, was there any way to salvage what was left of our marriage? One evening, as I sat at the dining table with a glass of whiskey in hand, I made a decision. I needed closure. Whether that meant rebuilding our relationship or letting it go, I couldn't move forward without confronting everything head-on. I picked up my phone and dialed Clara's number. She answered on the second ring. Michael? She said, her voice tentative. We need to talk, I said. Can you come by tomorrow? Of course, she said quickly. I'll be there. As I hung up, I felt a strange mix of dread and relief. Tomorrow would bring answers one way or another. The next day, Clara arrived just after noon. I'd spent the morning pacing the house, rehearsing what I wanted to say. But when I opened the door and saw her standing there, looking small and uncertain, every rehearsed line vanished from my mind. Hi, she said softly, clutching her bag like a shield. Come in, I replied, stepping aside. We sat in the living room, the silence between us thick and heavy. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of the situation pressing down like a lead blanket. Finally, I broke the silence. Clara, I began, my voice low. I need to know everything. No more half-truths. No more excuses. Just the truth. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You deserve that, she said. Ask me anything. The full story. How long has it been going on? I asked, my stomach twisting as I waited for her answer. She hesitated, then looked down at her hands. 6 months, she admitted. It started with text messages, then meeting up for coffee. I told myself it was harmless, but it wasn't. Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of betrayal. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my emotions in check. Was it just Ryan? I forced out, bracing myself for the answer. She shook her head. No, she whispered. There was someone else before him, but it didn't last. My breath caught, and for a moment, I thought I might explode. How could you do this to me? To us? I demanded, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. I don't know, she said, tears streaming down her face. I was unhappy, Michael. I felt like I was suffocating, like I wasn't myself anymore. And instead of talking to you, I made the worst decisions of my life. You think that excuses it? I shot back, my voice rising. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To our marriage? I'm sorry, she sobbed. I'm so sorry. A glimmer of understanding. Her apology hung in the air, raw and desperate. For a long moment, I just stared at her, my mind racing. I wanted to yell, to scream, to make her feel the pain she'd caused. But instead, I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. "Why didn't you tell me you were unhappy?" I asked quietly. "Why didn't you give me a chance to fix it?" "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that you wouldn't understand, that you'd think I was blaming you. And maybe I didn't want to face it myself." Her honesty cut through some of my anger, leaving behind a dull ache. I opened my eyes and met her gaze. "You had a choice," I said. "You could have come to me, Clara, but instead you chose to lie." She nodded, her face crumpling. "I know, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." The turning point. We sat in silence for a while, the enormity of the situation settling between us. Finally, Clara spoke. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Counseling, therapy, anything. I just want to fix this." I looked at her, the woman I'd loved for so long, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Could I forgive her? Could we rebuild what had been broken? Or was it too late? "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted, my voice cracking. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Her face crumpled, but she nodded. "I understand," she said. "But I'll fight for us, Michael. Even if it's too late, I'll fight." Her words stayed with me long after she left. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself grappling with the enormity of what lay ahead. Forgiveness, trust, healing. They felt like mountains too high to climb, but somewhere deep inside, a small spark of hope flickered. A choice to make. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the storm raging inside me. I sought advice from friends, family, even Dave. Everyone had an opinion, but in the end, I knew the decision was mine alone. One evening, as I sat in the quiet house, I picked up my phone and dialed Clara's number. She answered immediately, her voice tentative. "Michael, I've made a decision," I said, my heart pounding. "But I need to see you in person to talk about it." She agreed to come over the next day, and as I hung up, I felt a strange mix of dread and determination. Whatever happened next, it would shape the rest of our lives. And for the first time in weeks, I felt ready to face it. The following afternoon, Clara arrived at the house. This time, she carried no bag, only a tentative expression that mirrored the uncertainty in my heart. I stood in the doorway as she approached, taking in the sight of her. The woman I had loved for years looked like a stranger and yet so achingly familiar. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. She entered cautiously, as though the weight of her actions hung around her like a storm cloud. We settled into the living room, facing each other from opposite ends of the couch. I hadn't planned out what to say, but I knew it was time for answers. "I've thought a lot about us," I began, breaking the silence. "About everything that's happened and what it means." Clara's eyes searched mine, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "And I'm willing to try," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But there are conditions." Her breath hitched, and I saw a flicker of hope cross her face. "Anything," she said quickly. "I'll do whatever it takes." "Setting boundaries. First," I said, leaning forward. "There can be no more lies. I need total honesty from you, no matter how difficult it is. If you're not honest with me, this won't work." She nodded, her expression earnest. "I understand." "Second," I continued, "we're going to therapy. Together and individually. We can't rebuild this on our own." "Of course," she said. "I'll find someone." "No," I said firmly. "I'll find someone. Someone neutral." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." I hesitated before voicing the third condition. "And lastly, you need to cut all ties with Ryan. Completely. No contact, no excuses." Her face fell, but she didn't argue. I can do that," she said, though her voice wavered. "Can you?" I pressed. "Because if you can't, Clara, tell me now." She met my gaze, her eyes brimming with tears. "I can," she said, her voice stronger this time. I will. The first steps. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. Then we'll try, I said, the weight of my words settling over us. But this isn't forgiveness, Clara. Not yet. This is a chance. She nodded, her tears spilling over as she whispered, Thank you. Over the next few days, we began the slow process of rebuilding. True to her word, Clara deleted Ryan's number and blocked him on every platform. She also shared her passwords with me, a gesture of transparency that felt both reassuring and invasive. I hated that it had come to this, but trust had to start somewhere. I found a therapist who specialized in couples dealing with infidelity. Our first session was tense, filled with awkward silences and painful truths. Clara admitted to feeling unfulfilled, a sentiment that stung even though I'd suspected it. I shared my own feelings of betrayal and inadequacy, struggling to keep my emotions in check. Healing takes time, the therapist said at the end of the session, and it requires effort from both of you. This isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about finding a way forward, a glimpse of normalcy. As the weeks turned into months, Clara and I began to find a new rhythm. It wasn't the same as before, it couldn't be, but it was something. We cooked dinner together, went for walks, and even laughed at old jokes. Slowly, cautiously, we started to reconnect. But the scars remained. There were nights when I'd wake up and find her side of the bed empty, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. She'd always be downstairs, reading or sipping tea, but the fear lingered. I'm here, she said one night when she caught me watching her with that look of doubt. I'm not going anywhere, Michael. I wanted to believe her. Some days I almost did. A test of resolve. One evening, Clara came home later than expected. She told me she was meeting a friend for coffee, but as the hours stretched on, my anxiety grew. By the time she walked through the door, I was pacing the living room, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Where were you? I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked startled. I told you I was with Rachel. We lost track of time. You could have called, I said, the frustration spilling over. Do you have any idea what it's like for me? Sitting here and wondering if I'm lying? She finished, her tone weary. Michael, I'm doing everything I can to prove myself to you, but I can't live like this. I need you to meet me halfway. Her words cut deep because I knew she was right. If I couldn't let go of the suspicion, we would never move forward. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to calm down. I'm sorry, I said, my voice softer. It's just hard. She stepped closer, her expression earnest. I know it is, but I'm here, Michael. I'm not going anywhere. Fragile progress. That night, as we lay in bed, I found myself holding her hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. We were far from healed, but we were trying. And for now, that had to be enough. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized that our journey was just beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges and doubt. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope, a fragile, flickering light in the darkness. The progress Clara and I had made felt tenuous at best, like a fragile structure built on shaky ground. There were good days, days when we laughed, cooked together, and shared moments that reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with her. But the bad days loomed like storm clouds, dark and unyielding. It was on one of those bad days that everything seemed to unravel again. I came home late from work, tired and irritable. Clara was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. She looked up as I entered, her smile hesitant. Long day? She asked. Yeah, I muttered, shrugging off my coat. I noticed her phone on the counter. Its screen lit up with a notification. Instinctively, my eyes flicked to it. Michael, she said, catching my glance. Don't what? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Don't start, she said, her voice edged with frustration. You've been checking up on me constantly. I told you I'm trying. And I told you I need honesty. I shot back. If you've got nothing to hide, why does it bother you? She sighed, setting the spoon down with a clatter. Because it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough. Her words stung, but I couldn't let them slide. Maybe it's not, I said coldly. Maybe it'll never be enough. Breaking point. The silence that followed was thick and oppressive. Clara's shoulders sagged, and she looked down at her hands. I don't know what else to do, she said quietly. I've done everything you've asked, Michael. Everything. Then why does it still feel like you're hiding something? I demanded. Her head snapped up, her eyes blazing. Because you don't trust me. And honestly, I don't know if you ever will. Her words hit like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't respond. Was she right? Could I ever truly trust her again? Or was I holding on to something that was already broken beyond repair? Maybe I can't, I admitted finally, my voice low. But you're the one who broke it, Clara. Not me. She flinched as though I'd struck her, and for a moment, I regretted my words. But the anger inside me refused to relent. I need some air, I said, grabbing my coat and heading for the door. Michael, wait, she called after me. But I was already gone, seeking solace. I drove aimlessly through the city, my thoughts a chaotic mess. I ended up at Dave's place, knowing he'd be home. He opened the door, beer in hand, and took one look at my face before stepping aside to let me in. What happened? He asked, handing me a drink as we settled into his living room. Same thing as always, I said bitterly. I don't trust her. She's frustrated, and we're stuck in this endless cycle. Dave nodded, taking a sip of his beer. That's rough, man. But if you don't trust her, what's the point? His words stung because they echoed the doubts I'd been trying to suppress. I don't know, I admitted. I thought maybe we could fix this, but now I'm not so sure. Maybe you need to figure out what you really want, Dave said. Do you want to save your marriage? Or are you just afraid of letting it go? A new perspective. Dave's question lingered in my mind long after I left. What did I really want? I'd been so focused on rebuilding what Clara and I had lost that I hadn't stopped to consider if it was worth saving. When I returned home, Clara was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and puffy. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. I'm sorry, she said softly. For everything. For tonight. For everything. I sat down across from her, my anger replaced by a weary resignation. I'm sorry too, I said. But Clara, we can't keep doing this. We need to figure out what we're fighting for. She nodded, her tears spilling over. I want to fight for us, Michael. I do. But I need to know if you want that too. Her question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Did I want to fight for us? Or was I holding onto a dream that no longer existed? The decision. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that the answer wasn't simple. I loved Clara, that much I knew. But love wasn't enough to erase the betrayal or rebuild the trust that had been shattered. The next morning, I called our therapist and scheduled an emergency session. Clara and I needed help, not just to fix what was broken but to decide if it was even fixable. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that it might not be. As I hung up the phone, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. Whatever happened next, I knew it would be the hardest thing I'd ever faced. But it was time to face it head-on. The emergency therapy session was scheduled for Thursday evening. Clara and I arrived separately, a small detail that underscored the growing chasm between us. The waiting room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Clara sat across from me, fidgeting with the strap of her purse, while I stared blankly at a generic painting of a serene lake. The therapist, Dr. Bennett, ushered us into her office with a warm but professional smile. Her space was designed for comfort. Plush chairs, calming earth tones, and a small table adorned with a vase of fresh flowers. Clara and I took our seats, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. It's good to see you both, Dr. Bennett began, her tone gentle. Michael, you mentioned on the phone that there's been a lot of tension recently. Let's start there. I glanced at Clara before speaking. It feels like we're going in circles, I said. Every time we make progress, something happens to tear it all down again. I'm starting to wonder if we're just prolonging the inevitable. Clara's eyes widened, and she turned to me. The inevitable? She repeated. You mean ending this? I don't know, I admitted. But I can't keep living in this constant state of doubt and suspicion. The hard truths. Dr. Bennett leaned forward, her gaze steady. Clara, how does it feel to hear that? Clara's voice trembled as she spoke. It hurts, she said. But I understand why he feels that way. I've done things I can't take back. I've broken his trust, and now I'm watching him struggle to decide if I'm worth the effort. Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. I looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Dr. Bennett gave us a moment before speaking. Trust is a fragile thing, she said. It's hard to build and easy to break. Michael, you've mentioned feeling like you're stuck in a cycle. What would it take to break that cycle? I thought for a moment, choosing my words carefully. I need to know that we're working towards something real, I said. That this isn't just a temporary fix or a way to ease our guilt. If we're going to stay together, it has to mean something. Dr. Bennett nodded, then turned to Clara. And you, Clara? What do you need to move forward? Clara wiped at her eyes. I need Michael to believe in me again, she said. I know I've given him every reason not to, but I'm doing everything I can to show him I'm committed. Her voice broke, and she looked at me, her expression pleading. I'm not the person I was when I made those mistakes. I'm trying so hard to be better, Michael, but I can't do it alone. A breakthrough. Dr. Bennett let the silence settle before speaking. It's clear that you both care deeply about each other, but caring isn't enough. Trust and communication are the foundation of any relationship, and right now those foundations are cracked. She paused, letting her words sink in. Rebuilding takes time and effort from both of you, but it also requires a willingness to let go of the past. If you keep dragging those old wounds into the present, they'll continue to define your relationship. Her words struck a chord. I'd been holding onto the betrayal like a shield, using it to justify my anger and protect myself from further hurt. But in doing so, I was also preventing any real healing from taking place. I don't know if I can let it go, I admitted. Not yet. That's okay, Dr. Bennett said. Healing isn't linear, and it's not immediate. What matters is that you're willing to try. Clara reached for my hand, her touch hesitant. I'll wait, she said. As long as it takes, I'll wait. Finding balance. The session ended with a plan. Dr. Bennett encouraged us to focus on small, actionable steps rather than trying to tackle everything at once. Weekly check-ins, individual therapy for both of us, and scheduled time to reconnect without the weight of our issues looming over us. As we left her office, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the car, Clara turned to me. Thank you, she said, for not giving up. I nodded, staring out the windshield. We've got a long way to go. I know, she said, but I'm not going anywhere. Her words lingered in my mind as I drove us home. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. The weeks following our emergency therapy session were a mix of cautious optimism and lingering doubt. Clara and I adhered to the plan Dr. Bennett had laid out. Our weekly check-ins were structured but emotionally draining. We talked about our days, shared small victories, and revisited painful truths when necessary. One Friday evening, Clara suggested we cook dinner together. It was something we hadn't done in years, and despite my reservations, I agreed. Standing side by side in the kitchen, slicing vegetables and joking about my terrible knife skills, felt almost normal. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe normal wasn't entirely out of reach. You still cut onions like you're afraid of them, she teased, her laughter soft but genuine. And you still oversalt everything? I shot back, smirking. Her eyes met mine, and something passed between us. A flicker of the connection we'd once shared. It wasn't a grand moment, but it felt significant nonetheless. Small steps. The following week, during one of our therapy sessions, Dr. Bennett brought up the idea of creating new traditions. It's important to rebuild not just trust but also the joy in your relationship, she said. Shared experiences can help anchor you in the present. Clara's face lit up at the suggestion. What if we started doing a Friday movie night? We could take turns picking the film. I hesitated, the idea feeling almost too simple in the face of everything we'd been through. But then I saw the hope in her eyes and nodded. Okay, I said. Let's try it. Our first movie night was awkward but not unpleasant. Clara chose a light-hearted comedy, and though I wasn't particularly invested in the film, I found myself laughing alongside her. It was a small step, but it felt like progress. The outside world. As we worked on rebuilding our relationship, the outside world inevitably crept in. Friends and family began to notice the changes, and questions followed. How are things with Clara? Dave asked one evening over a beer. His tone was careful, as though he didn't want to push too hard. We're trying, I said honestly. It's not perfect, but it's better than it was. Dave nodded. That's good to hear. Just make sure you're doing this for the right reasons. Don't stay just because it's easier than leaving. His words stuck with me, and that night, I found myself replaying them as I lay in bed. Was I staying because I truly believed in our future, or because I was afraid of what life would look like without her? The question lingered, unanswered, a test of trust. One evening, Clara came home later than expected. She told me she was meeting a friend for coffee, but as the hours stretched on, my anxiety grew. By the time she walked through the door, I was pacing the living room, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Where were you? I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked startled. I told you I was with Rachel. We lost track of time. You could have called, I said, the frustration spilling over. Do you have any idea what it's like for me? Sitting here and wondering if I'm lying? She finished, her tone weary. Michael, I'm doing everything I can to prove myself to you, but I can't live like this. I need you to meet me halfway. Her words cut deep because I knew she was right. If I couldn't let go of the suspicion, we would never move forward. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to calm down. I'm sorry, I said, my voice softer. It's just hard. She stepped closer, her expression earnest. I know it is, but I'm here, Michael. I'm not going anywhere. Turning point. The next morning, Clara surprised me with tickets to a weekend getaway at a cabin a few hours away. I thought we could use some time to ourselves, she said, her smile tentative. I hesitated but eventually agreed. The idea of getting away from everything, the house, the memories, the weight of it all, was appealing. The trip turned out to be exactly what we needed. The cabin was cozy, nestled in a forest with a view of a tranquil lake. We spent the days hiking, talking, and rediscovering the simple joys of being together. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Clara reached for my hand. Thank you for giving us this chance, she said. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful. I looked at her, the woman I'd loved and struggled with, and for the first time, I felt something shift. The anger and resentment that had consumed me for so long began to loosen its grip. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step closer. I'm grateful too, I said, my voice quiet. For the good days. We sat in silence, the crackling of the fire filling the space between us. The road ahead was still uncertain, but in that moment, it felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. The months that followed our weekend getaway at the cabin were marked by cautious progress. Clara and I continued our therapy sessions, navigating the labyrinth of trust and forgiveness. There were moments of connection, glimpses of the love we had once shared, but the shadow of her betrayal lingered, a reminder of how far we still had to go. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Clara turned to me. Michael, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Do you ever think about what our future looks like? I took a deep breath, considering her question. I do, I admitted, but it's hard to see it clearly. There are days when I think we can make it, and others when you doubt, she finished softly. I understand. She reached for my hand, and for the first time I didn't pull away. Her touch was warm, grounding me in the moment. "I want to keep fighting for us," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I also know that it's not just about what I want. You have to want this too." Her honesty was both disarming and sobering. I nodded, my throat tight. "I do want this," I said. "But it's not easy. Trust isn't something I can just switch back on." "I know," she said, "and I'll keep waiting, as long as it takes." The final test. As our anniversary approached, Clara suggested we do something to mark the occasion. "It doesn't have to be anything big," she said. "Just something to remind us of why we started this journey together." Reluctantly, I agreed. We decided to revisit the restaurant where we'd celebrated our first anniversary. A small Italian place tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The evening was pleasant, filled with nostalgia and tentative smiles. For a few hours, it felt like we were simply Michael and Clara again, without the weight of the past bearing down on us. But as the night wore on, I found myself grappling with a question that had been simmering in the back of my mind for weeks. Was love enough to overcome everything we had been through? A heartfelt decision. That night, as we walked back to the car, I stopped Clara on the sidewalk. The streetlights cast a soft glow around us, and the air was cool and crisp. "Clara," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. "I need to say something." She turned to me, her expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. "What is it?" I hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I love you," I said. "I always have. But love isn't enough to erase what's happened. And as much as I want to believe we can make this work, I think we both know that some wounds don't heal completely." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Are you saying you want to end this?" "I'm saying that we need to find peace," I said gently. "For both of us. And maybe that means letting go." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Clara nodded slowly, her tears spilling over. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. "But I understand." A bittersweet goodbye. The weeks that followed were a blur of difficult conversations and quiet goodbyes. We agreed to part on amicable terms, both of us acknowledging that our journey together had reached its end. Clara moved in with her sister temporarily, while I began the process of finding my own footing in a life without her. Despite the pain, there was a sense of closure that brought a strange kind of relief. We had tried, given it everything we had, but sometimes love alone wasn't enough. And that was okay. Moving forward. Months later, I found myself sitting on a park bench, watching the world go by. The sun was warm on my face, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of calm. Clara and I still exchanged the occasional message. A birthday wish here, a quick update there. But our lives had diverged, each of us forging a new path. As I sat there, a small child ran past, laughing as he chased a kite. His joy was infectious, and I couldn't help but smile. Life was full of moments like this, small, fleeting bursts of happiness that reminded me of the beauty in moving forward. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had softened, leaving behind a bittersweet ache. And in its place, a quiet resilience had taken root. I stood and began walking, the sun dipping low on the horizon. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. Alone, but not broken. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.